Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a truly global game of cat and mouse. It's this high-stakes chess match, really, involving billions of dollars, a mysterious ghost fleet, and geopolitical tensions stretching all the way from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, even into the South China Sea.
It really is a vast web.
Yeah, and we're going to dive deep into this intricate world of Iranian oil smuggling. We'll look at Malaysia's surprisingly pivotal role, kind of a shadowy hub in this whole thing. And crucially, how the escalating conflict over the Middle East is sending these ripples through the global energy market and that delicate, often precarious balance of U.S.-China relations.
It connects everything, doesn't it?
It really does. So our mission, as always, is to try and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, help you understand what's really happening beneath the surface of those headlines. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's an incredibly complex picture, you're right. And it immediately highlights the sheer ingenuity, or maybe audacity, depending on your perspective, that Iran uses to keep its oil exports flowing, even with these crippling international sanctions in place.
Right, it's not just finding loopholes, is it? It sounds like a really sophisticated adaptive system they've got going.
Oh, absolutely. It's allowed them to maintain a pretty significant revenue stream despite just immense pressure.
So how exactly do they do it? How does Iran manage to keep this oil flowing and, evade the watchful eyes of sanctions enforcers? What are the core tactics of this so-called ghost fleet?
Well, it's quite a masterclass in obfuscation, really. The ghost fleet itself refers to this vast network of tankers, and they use a whole range of tactics to basically disappear from global tracking and hide where the cargo's coming from.
Disappear. How?
Well, one of the most fundamental methods is just turning off their automatic identification systems, AIS.
Ah, the transponders.
Exactly. All vessels over a certain size have to have them legally. They broadcast position, course, speed. So when these tankers switch off their AIs, they literally vanish from public tracking maps.
Wow. Just gone. A huge ship.
Imagine that, yeah. A supertanker, hundreds of meters long, just ceasing to exist on a digital chart. And this lets them operate in complete stealth, particularly when they're doing illicit activities.
Okay, so they go dark. What else?
Well, beyond simply disappearing, they engage in these highly coordinated, often clandestine ship-to-ship transfers, STS transfers, right out in the middle of the ocean.
Ship to ship, out at sea. That sounds complicated and risky.
It's incredibly complex. You've got one tanker full of Iranian crude pulling up alongside another vessel. Sometimes that's a legitimate commercial tanker. Sometimes it's another ghost ship, often under cover of darkness, in remote waters far from the usual shipping lanes. Minimizes detection.
And they just pump the oil across.
They pump the oil from one ship to the other. Logistically challenging, definitely, and inherently risky. You're talking huge volumes of highly flammable liquid being transferred at sea, but it's incredibly effective in breaking that chain of custody, obscuring the origin.
And then once it's transferred, they often kind of rebrand the oil, don't they? Make it seem like it came from somewhere else or mix it up.
Precisely. Once the oil's transferred, it can be relabeled, its documentation falsified, or, it can be blended with non-Iranian crude. This whole process makes it exceptionally difficult for authorities to trace it back to Iran. It's essentially laundering the oil.
It's like money laundering, but for crude.
Exactly. And these combined methods, they've proven remarkably successful, almost astonishingly so.
How successful are we talking?
Well, look at the International Energy Agency, the IEA. Highly respected source for global energy data. They say Iranian oil exports have managed to maintain a consistent, pretty substantial level, around 1.7 million barrels per day, throughout this year.
1.7 million barrels a day. Seriously. Even with U.S. sanctions, even the ones on Chinese buyers that kicked in back in March.
Yep. Even with those sanctions supposedly in full effect, it's a staggering figure. And it just underscores the profound challenges, the complexities of trying to enforce sanctions like this in a global energy market that's so fluid, so adaptable, so interconnected.
It really shows that tension, doesn't it? The political will to sanction versus the economic need for cheap energy somewhere, and just the sheer cleverness of those trying to get around the rules.
Absolutely, it's a constant cat and mouse game.
So 1.7 million barrels a day, that's huge. And this is where Malaysia seems to step into the spotlight, right? It's become this critical, almost notorious hub in the shadows for this trade. What makes Malaysia so central?
Yeah, Malaysia's location is absolutely critical, strategically invaluable for this shadow trade. It's a key transit point and, like you said, a kind of laundering hub for Iranian oil.
Why there,
Yeah.
specifically?
Well, partly proximity to major shipping lanes, it's busy port infrastructure, and maybe, historically, a regulatory environment that hasn't always been, let's say, hyper-vigilant about scrutinizing these opaque shipping activities.
Right.
And we saw a very concrete example recently. Bloomberg reported back on March 28th this year, 2025, that over 10 sanctioned Iranian crude oil tankers were found essentially, well, stranded, loitering near Malaysia's shores.
Stranded. What does that actually mean in this context? Are they stuck or just waiting?
Yeah, that was seen by some as maybe a sign that Iran's shipments to China, their main buyer, might be slowing down, maybe increased scrutiny, maybe the market was saturated for a bit.
But stranded. Were they waiting for another ship-to-ship transfer, maybe? Or did they actually have trouble finding buyers?
Yeah. And that's exactly the ambiguity, isn't it? That's what makes the shadow economy so hard to fully pin down. The reports weren't clear if they were just waiting for the right moment for another STS transfer, maybe waiting for weather or a gap in satellite surveillance, or if they really were hitting hiccups in the demand chain, waiting for specific buyers from China's private refineries, the teapots.
Because the market for sanctioned oil must be pretty jittery, sensitive to risk.
Inherently volatile, exactly. But what is clear, unequivocally, is the sheer scale of the activity. The amount of Iranian oil seen near Malaysia and Singapore around that time, it was reported as the highest since August, though the year wasn't specified. It just shows how central this Southeast Asian maritime corridor has become for Iran's export strategy. It's a massive logistical nexus for this illicit trade.
It really sounds like Malaysia itself is walking a very, very delicate diplomatic tightrope here. I mean, on one hand, they keep up these consistent diplomatic ties with Iran, right? Iranians can even travel there without a visa. That suggests some level of, connection.
There's definitely a relationship there.
But then, on the other hand, they must be under immense pressure from the United States. How do they manage that balancing act?
It is a masterclass in delicate diplomatic balancing, yes. You had, for example, former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad openly condemning U.S. sanctions against Iran, talking about sovereignty, non-interference.
Right.
But in practice, Malaysia has ultimately kind of bowed down to Washington's pressure to enforce them, at least to some extent.
It's a tough spot for smaller nations caught between giants.
It really is. It's not unique to Malaysia. They're caught between major global powers with conflicting interests, and the U.S. has the ability to impose significant economic pain. Even Petronas, Malaysia's national oil company, they've had historical interest in Iranian fields, signed MOUs, but their engagement has been inconsistent.
So they're being pragmatic, adhering to international concerns, maybe protecting their own access to finance and markets.
Exactly. It shows a pragmatic adherence to those broader international concerns and just the practicalities of operating globally. Compliance with U.S. sanctions can be critical for accessing finance, technology, other markets, national economic interests versus global politics, and the huge reach of U.S. financial power.
Okay, so all this incredibly elaborate activity, the ghost fleets going dark, the secret transfers at sea, the murky money trails, it all seems to lead, primarily anyway, to one main destination, China, specifically its private refineries. Why China? And why those particular refineries?
You've nailed the crucial endpoint of this whole shadow supply chain, despite all the complex clandestine stuff. Yeah, a huge chunk of this laundered Iranian crude ends up in China. And within China, it's particularly the independent, often smaller private refineries, the teapots, as they're sometimes called.
The teapots, why them?
Well, these refineries, often in places like Shandong province, they're key because they operate with a bit more flexibility. They're typically less integrated into the big state-owned enterprise system.
So less direct government control, maybe. More willing to take risks.
Potentially more willing, or perhaps just more able, to take on the risks that come with buying sanctioned oil. And, crucially, they can often get this oil at a significant discount. That goes straight to their bottom line, their profitability.
Right, cheaper crude.
Which makes them a perfect, if illicit, customer for Iran. They can bypass the bigger state-owned companies who are much more vulnerable to direct U.S. pressure and sanctions.
And Iran has apparently gone to great lengths to make sure these buyers get a steady supply, even moving their storage around. Tell us about that.
Yes, it's quite telling. It shows Iran's strategic commitment to keeping these illicit supply lines open. Vortexa data, they track global shipping, indicates Iran has strategically repositioned a big chunk of its floating oil storage fleet much closer to China.
Floating storage. How much are we talking?
Well, the whole fleet is massive, about 36 vessels holding roughly 40 million barrels of oil.
40 million barrels just floating out there.
Yep. To put that in perspective, that's maybe 2 or 3 days of total global oil consumption. But the key thing is the relocation. About 8 million barrels, spread across 10 tankers, are now positioned directly offshore China.
They moved them. From where?
They relocated from the Singapore area, where there's still another 20 million barrels or so on other tankers.
Wow. So they basically moved a significant chunk of their inventory right to China's doorstep.
Exactly. It's a strategic move. Ensures supply is readily available near the primary customer, cuts down transit times, reduces the risk of getting caught on longer voyages. It really shows Iran being proactive, understanding the market dynamics, the logistical challenges of dodging sanctions. It's almost like they set up a floating gas station right outside their customer's door.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. How does the U.S. respond to all this intricate adaptive web of evasion? And what does this ongoing cat-and-mouse game mean for that bigger, often tense relationship between the U.S. and China? It's not just about sanctions anymore, is it?
Right.
It feels like it's tangled up in their wider strategic competition.
No, it's far from just sanctions in a vacuum. The U.S. strategy has definitely evolved to try and target the entire supply chain from Iran all the way to the end buyers in China. The Trump administration, over time, announced multiple rounds of economic sanctions, and they didn't just target Iranian tankers. Crucially, they went after the small and private refineries in China, too, the ultimate buyers.
And these sanctions have real teeth. Freezing assets, cutting off access to the U.S. financial system.
Oh, yes, severe penalties. Since late February of an unspecified year, for example, a staggering figure, over 2/3 of the tankers known to be carrying Iranian crude have been officially sanctioned. That makes it incredibly difficult and risky for shipping companies, insurers, banks to deal with them without risking their own access to global markets.
And then there was that specific action on June 22nd, 2025. The AP reported the U.S. Treasury went after a specific Chinese refinery in Shandong province directly. That sounds like a major escalation, targeting an end user like that. What was the accusation there?
That Shandong refinery was accused of buying over $1 billion worth of Iranian oil.
$1 billion? Okay, that's substantial, not small change.
Not at all. It indicates a pretty significant ongoing trade relationship. But what really dials up the seriousness, from the U.S. perspective anyway, is the claim that some of this oil came from a front company for Iran's paramilitary Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC.
Ah, the IRGC, which the U.S. designates as a terrorist organization.
Precisely. So linking the oil trade directly to the IRGC, that significantly escalates the perceived threat and the justification the U.S. uses for these sanctions. The U.S. government also filed a separate lawsuit trying to seize revenue from 1 million barrels of Iranian oil, again, specifically because of alleged IRGC links. They're trying to choke off the financing.
Right. So these new penalties from OFAC, the Treasury's enforcement arm, they're part of this bigger push to cut the flow of Iranian oil and the money supporting what the U.S. sees as bad actors.
Exactly. The rationale is clear. Cut off the oil revenue, reduce Tehran's ability to finance its government and its support for various militant groups across the region. That's the stated goal.
So the U.S. is trying to cut off the money, arguing it fuels Iran's government and militant proxies. But what's China's official line on this? How do they react when their companies get hit with these penalties?
Well, China's official response has been pretty consistent and quite firm. They oppose these kinds of extraterritorial sanctions. A spokesperson for their embassy in Washington stated quite openly that using sanctions like this undermines international trade order and rules, disrupts normal economic and trade exchanges, and infringes upon the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies and individuals.
So standard pushback against what they see as U.S. overreach.
Pretty much. It highlights China's long-standing objection to what it sees as unilateral sanctions extending beyond a nation's borders, interfering with sovereign trade. Beijing views these actions as infringing on its economic sovereignty, messing with its legitimate trade interests, even if that trade involves entities sanctioned by the U.S.
Interesting timing, too, you mentioned, the sanctions announcement and the nuclear talks.
Yeah, it's worth noting. These specific sanctions were announced the very same day Iran confirmed its next round of nuclear talks with the U.S. would be in Wyoming. It just hints at the complex, sometimes contradictory diplomatic signals flying around.
This whole situation with Iranian oil, it really feels like just one piece, maybe a very visible piece, of that much larger, much more complex U.S.-China relationship puzzle, doesn't it? Beyond these specific sanctions, there are these wider economic strategic tensions that must shape how both sides react here.
Absolutely. It's deeply embedded. The oil trade issue is just one facet, maybe a particularly messy one, within that broader U.S.-China dynamic. That includes everything, right? Trade tariffs, tech competition, human rights concerns, military posturing in the Indo-Pacific. It's all intertwined.
And despite all the tough talk, the competition,
Yeah.
experts still think there are limits, that they won't let it completely spiral.
Well, some experts, like Ryan Haas at Brookings, he used to be the China director on the NSC, believe that leaders like Trump and Xi, while they definitely act tough for various audiences, ultimately won't allow free fall in U.S.-China ties. There's still this underlying recognition, perhaps, of the deep economic interdependence. A complete decoupling would be incredibly damaging for both.
But the dynamics are shifting, aren't they? Like the U.S. tariff war.
Yeah.
Did that actually strengthen China's hand in some ways?
That's a really interesting point some analysts make. While the tariffs were meant to pressure China economically, one reported unintended consequence was maybe strengthening Beijing's hand. How? By prompting China to reassess its vulnerabilities, reduce its reliance on the U.S.
Like cutting back on U.S. Treasury holdings.
Exactly. China cut its U.S. Treasury stockpiles to a 16-year low. Now, that could be a response to trade tensions, but it also gives China more financial flexibility, reduces its exposure to potential U.S. financial leverage. Some analysts have even gone further, suggesting Trump administration actions, tariffs, sanctions have inadvertently harmed the U.S. dollar's global standing, creating what they called a golden opportunity for China to maybe boost the yuan internationally or pursue trading mechanisms that bypass the dollar altogether.
And it's not just finance, is it? The tech curbs, too.
Yeah.
Aimed at slowing China down, but maybe having the opposite effect.
That's another crucial, almost paradoxical point. U.S. tech curbs restrictions on semiconductors, advanced computing tech, they were definitely aimed at limiting China in strategic areas like AI, 5G. But they seem to have inadvertently just pushed China to double down on domestic innovation, fostering greater self-reliance.
So pouring money into their own chip industry.
Massive investment in their own chip foundries, research, accelerating that drive for indigenous innovation. So the scenario becomes, maybe instead of weakening China long-term, these curbs end up forging a more self-reliant and ultimately perhaps a more formidable long-term competitor. It's a strategic gamble with potentially huge, maybe unforeseen consequences.
What's really striking, though, looking at the whole picture, is how consistent the U.S. strategic priority seems to remain. Analysts noted even on June 22, 2025, that Mideast distractions won't shift U.S.'s long-term focus on China. That suggests even when things flare up dramatically in the Middle East, Washington's primary long-term strategic focus stays locked on China.
Right. Even when assets get redeployed, diplomatic bandwidth is consumed, military resources are engaged elsewhere. The underlying strategic aim seems to remain managing and competing with China. It's the big overarching challenge driving a lot of U.S. foreign policy, even when other crises demand attention.
Okay, so let's connect this back to the current situation. If we look at the bigger picture, what's happening right now in the Middle East, it's obviously not just a regional issue anymore. Its reverberations are being felt globally, especially in these shadowy oil markets we've been discussing, and definitely in the strategic calculations of the U.S. and China.
Absolutely. The recent escalation has direct, immediate implications. For global oil supplies, for overall geopolitical stability, it's huge.
And the escalation has been pretty stark, hasn't it?
Yeah.
We've seen direct U.S. military involvement now in the Israel-Iran conflict, moving beyond just sanctions or diplomatic pressure. What exactly happened there?
Indeed, the conflict took a very significant, very concerning turn. The U.S. military directly inserted itself into what Israel stated were efforts to decapitate Iran's nuclear program. That happened on June 22nd, 2025.
What did they do?
They struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites early that day. That was reported by Taipei Times, AP News. U.S. President Donald Trump then publicly claimed they were successful airstrikes that obliterated the sites. And he added a very clear threat of more attacks to come. That signals a real willingness to escalate further.
Wow, that's a huge step. Direct military action on Iranian territory, targeting nuclear sites.
It's a monumental step, yes. A definite shift from indirect support or sanctions to direct military action.
And Iran's reaction, it must have been furious. They'd see that as a major provocation, a direct attack.
Predictably, yes. Fiery and ominous. Iran's foreign minister immediately warned of everlasting consequences. That's a clear threat. This won't be forgotten, won't go unpunished. He stated flat out that the U.S. and Israel had crossed a big red line, implying, whatever lines existed before, they've now been definitively breached.
And internationally,
The Iranian ambassador to the UN echoed that on the world stage, called the strikes heinous and illegal acts of aggression.
so what happens next? How is Iran likely to respond, conventionally?
Well, that's the big question. Strong predictions from intelligence circles and analysts suggest Iran probably won't respond conventionally. A direct military fight against superior U.S. and Israeli forces, that's likely not their preferred route.
So, asymmetrical warfare.
That's the expectation, asymmetrical warfare, which could mean a lot of things. Using their network of operatives, proxies across the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, Syria, the Houthis in Yemen.
Launching attacks from there. Drones, missiles.
Exactly. Missile attacks, drone strikes, sabotage against U.S. interests or allies in the Middle East. Plus, Iran has sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. They could unleash those against critical infrastructure, financial systems.
And that kind of response is much harder to predict, harder to defend against, harder to pin down who exactly did it.
Precisely. It makes it a highly destabilizing form of retaliation.
So, okay, beyond the immediate conflict zone, what are the wider implications? For the global oil trade we started with, for overall global stability, we're already seeing the economic impact, right?
We are. It's a stark reminder of how interconnected it all is, the most direct, tangible impact. That immediate and sustained rise in international crude oil prices.
Right.
The ongoing conflict has already pushed international crude prices up for the third week running. And that translates directly into higher gasoline and diesel prices for consumers everywhere. You mentioned Taiwan's C Corp reported NT Dartle's 1 cent per liter increase. Seems small, but multiply that across global consumption.
Billions of dollars in increased costs.
Yeah.
For individuals, businesses, supply chains, fueling inflation, potentially slowing down economy.
Exactly. Huge economic ripple effects.
And this brings up a critical point, especially when we talk oil instability, the Strait of Hormuz. Given Iran's threats, their capacity for this asymmetrical stuff, that vital choke point feels like an even bigger global worry now, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You're right. While maybe not explicitly stated as a direct call in all sources, the combination of events, the escalating conflict, Iran's direct threats, their known ability to disrupt shipping it immediately elevates the security of the Strait of Hormuz to a paramount global concern.
Just remind us how vital that strait is.
It's that narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. It is the critical choke point for global oil. About 20% of the world's crude oil goes through there. That's roughly 21 million barrels every single day.
21 million barrels a day. So any disruption.
Any significant disruption, let alone a closure, it would send immediate catastrophic shockwaves through the global economy. Massive spike in oil prices, potentially triggering a global recession. For countries heavily reliant on those imports, China, Japan, India, it's almost an existential threat to their economic stability.
Okay, so this brings China back into the frame in a big way. They're Iran's largest oil customer, even the sanctions stuff. They have long-standing diplomatic strategic ties with Iran. Does this raise the question of China's potential influence? Could the U.S. call on China, or could China act on its own to try and prevent Iran from disrupting the strait?
That's precisely the strategic question now, isn't it? And it puts China in a remarkably complex position. Well, on one hand, China has this direct, overwhelming economic interest in keeping oil flowing freely through Hormuz. Its economy absolutely depends on those imports, including the illicit flow from Iran. A closure would cripple their energy supply.
But on the other hand, their relationship with Iran.
On the other hand, they've cultivated this long-standing diplomatic and strategic relationship with Tehran, built on energy trade, arms sales, sometimes shared geopolitical interests, often aligned in opposing U.S. influence.
So that relationship, plus being Iran's biggest customer, that gives them unique leverage.
It potentially gives China a unique position to exert influence on Tehran, maybe to de-escalate, maybe to specifically avoid actions that would disrupt the strait.
So the U.S. would have every reason to want China to step in and prevent that, especially given the U.S.'s own direct involvement now in the conflict.
Exactly. For Washington, calling on China isn't just about economic stability. It's about managing a potential multi-front crisis. The challenge for China, though, is immense. How do they balance that strategic partnership with Iran against their vital economic self-interest and their desire to probably avoid getting drawn into a direct U.S. confrontation over the strait?
So whether China would or even could effectively prevent a disruption, that's a critical, unanswered question right now.
A huge one. Global powers are definitely watching that. It's a high-stakes diplomatic tightrope that could really reshape regional power dynamics.
And looking even broader, beyond oil, how does this Middle East flare-up connect back to that primary U.S. strategic focus we talked about China?
This is where the interconnectedness gets really stark. It shows the profound ripple effects. One expert suggested, just on June 23, 2025, that direct U.S. involvement in Iran could, remarkably, prompt China to actually accelerate its strategic actions towards Taiwan, the South China Sea, across the first island chain.
Accelerate. Why? Because they think the U.S. is distracted.
The reasoning is chillingly pragmatic, yeah. China might perceive the U.S. as incapable of fighting a two-front war. If the U.S. is deeply bogged down in the Middle East, pouring military and diplomatic resources there, China might see a window of opportunity, a chance to pursue its own objectives in the Indo-Pacific more aggressively, betting the U.S. would be stretched too thin to respond effectively on multiple fronts.
Wow. That really highlights how interconnected these global hotspots are. One move here affects calculations over there.
Absolutely. And it brings up that other huge question.
Right.
Would Iran's allies, regional ones, but also global ones like Russia and China, actually come to its defense if the U.S. fully joins the war?
What kind of defense? Not necessarily troops, maybe.
It could range hugely. Diplomatic support, economic aid, intelligence sharing, maybe even military assistance like weapons supplies or more support for proxies. The potential for that kind of development to escalate things into a far wider, potentially even global conflict. That's obviously a critical consideration, a major worry for international policymakers. The whole geopolitical chessboard is just incredibly dynamic. Every move in one region can have profound, unexpected consequences somewhere else entirely.
So we've navigated this clandestine world of Iran's ghost fleet. We've seen Malaysia's pivotal, if somewhat controversial role as the shadowy hub, and explored how the U.S. tries to cut those ties, often running up against its complex, always shifting relationship with China.
And the consistent flow of that Iranian oil, despite all the sanctions, the shifting alliances, the huge ripple effects from regional conflicts, it all just points to an incredibly dynamic and challenging global landscape. It really is a constant adaptation game for everyone involved, a complex dance between economic necessity, strategic ambition, and geopolitical pressure that reshapes our world almost daily.
This deep dive really underscores how tightly woven these threads are, doesn't it? Energy, economics, geopolitics. You just can't talk about one without bumping into the others. We hope this deep dive has given you, our listeners, a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of these incredibly interconnected global events.